Imagine a teenage peasant girl who could not read or write. She had no army, no training, and no reason to be believed. And yet she would convince a king, lead soldiers into battle, and change the fate of an entire nation. This is Joan of Arc, the shepherd girl who heard voices from heaven and became a warrior saint. But before we drift off into the story, leave a like and comment where you are listening from so others can find their way here too. Now, let us journey back to a kingdom torn apart by war to discover how one young woman defied everything the world expected of her. The story of Joan of Arc begins in a France that was bleeding to death. For nearly a century, the kingdom had been locked in a brutal and seemingly endless conflict with England. Historians call this the 100 Years' War, though it would actually stretch across 116 years of bloodshed, famine, and despair. The war had started in 1337 over a simple but explosive question. Who had the rightful claim to the French throne? The English kings believed they had a legitimate blood claim through their ancestors. The French, of course, disagreed. What followed was generation after generation of warfare that left the French countryside scarred and its people exhausted. The conflict was not a single continuous war, but rather a series of devastating campaigns separated by fragile truces. Armies marched back and forth across the land. They burned villages and trampled crops. They laid siege to towns and left famine in their wake. The common people, the peasants who worked the fields and tended the livestock, suffered the most. They were caught between two warring powers, robbed by both sides, forced to watch their homes destroyed again and again. For the ordinary French farmer, the war was not a distant political struggle. It was a never-ending nightmare. By the time Joan was born around 1412, France was not losing the war. France was dying. The situation had grown catastrophic after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. On a muddy field in northern France, a small and exhausted English army, led by King Henry V, faced a massive French force. The French knights were confident. They outnumbered the English perhaps 5-1. They were the flower of French chivalry, armoured in the finest steel, mounted on powerful war horses. They expected a glorious victory. Instead, they rode into a slaughter. The English longbowmen unleashed a devastating storm of arrows. The muddy ground sucked at the hooves of the French horses and the feet of their armoured knights. The English cut them down by the thousands. The cream of French nobility lay dead in the mud. The kingdom's military power was shattered in a single afternoon. The French losses were staggering. Thousands of knights and men-at-arms were killed. Many of the greatest nobles in the realm fell on that terrible day. 3 dukes, 5 counts, and 90 lords lost their lives. The English, in contrast, lost only a few hundred men. It was not merely a defeat, it was a national catastrophe. The battle proved that the traditional French method of warfare, the cavalry charge of armoured knights, was obsolete against the deadly English longbow. But the French nobility had learned nothing from their earlier disasters. They had charged straight into slaughter, and now the kingdom lay defenceless before its enemy. The disaster at Agincourt was followed by an even greater betrayal. The French queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and the powerful Duke of Burgundy turned against their own king. They signed a treaty that did the unthinkable. It declared that the English king, Henry V, was the rightful heir to the French throne. The legitimate French prince, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited. He was publicly declared to be illegitimate, a bastard with no right to the crown. His own mother had signed away his birthright. France itself was to be swallowed by England. The treaty was sealed with a royal marriage. Henry V wed the French Princess Catherine. Their future son would inherit both kingdoms, uniting England and France under one English ruler forever. This was the shattered world into which Joan of Arc was born. She came from Domremy, a small farming village in the northeastern borderlands of France. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a peasant farmer of modest means. He was also one of the village leaders, a man who collected taxes and organised the local militia. Her mother, Isabel, taught her simple prayers and the basic tenets of the Catholic faith. She taught Joan the Our Father, the Hail Mary and the Creed. These prayers would sustain Joan for the rest of her short life. Joan never learned to read or write. In her world, literacy was a luxury reserved for priests and nobles. A peasant girl had no use for books. Her childhood was spent like that of any other peasant girl of her time. She tended sheep in the fields. She helped with the household chores. She learned to spin wool and sew. She was known in the village for her piety, often slipping away to pray in the small church. She made pilgrimages to a local shrine and gave alms to the poor whenever she could. The villagers remembered her as a good and quiet girl, devout and hard-working. She was, by every measure, an ordinary girl from a completely unremarkable family. There was nothing in her birth or her upbringing to suggest she would become anything other than a peasant wife and mother. Nothing, that is, except the voices. Even in her remote village, the war touched everything. Domremy lay in contested territory, and the villagers were forced to flee their homes more than once when hostile troops approached. Once, when Joan was young, enemy soldiers burned the village church. The constant threat of violence and the sight of refugees fleeing down the roads must have made a deep impression on the young girl. She grew up knowing that France was in peril, that foreign invaders occupied her country, and that the true king was denied his throne. When Joan was around 13 years old, something extraordinary happened. She was standing in her father's garden on a summer day when she saw a brilliant light and heard a voice speaking to her. She was terrified at first. She believed the voice came from God. Soon she began to identify the voices more specifically. She said they were the voices of saints, Saint Michael, the warrior archangel who commands the armies of heaven, St. Catherine of Alexandria, a learned and courageous martyr who had debated pagan philosophers, St. Margaret of Antioch, another virgin martyr who had defied a pagan ruler. These heavenly figures spoke to her, she claimed, as clearly as one person speaks to another. The visions were vivid and real to her. She said she could see the saints standing before her, surrounded by light, beautiful beyond description. She could touch them and embrace them. They smelled sweet like flowers. She wept when they left her, wishing she could follow them to paradise. These experiences were utterly real to Joan. She would never waver in her belief, not even when faced with torture and death. To modern ears, the idea of hearing voices from saints may sound like madness or delusion. But in the medieval world, such visions were part of the fabric of religious life. Holy men and women throughout history had claimed to receive divine messages. Joan's experiences placed her in a long tradition of Christian visionaries. At first, the voices simply instructed her to be a good and pious girl. But as the years passed and France sank deeper into despair, the messages became more urgent and more specific. The voices told her that she had been chosen by God for a sacred mission. She must go to the Dauphin, the disinherited Prince Charles. She must help him reclaim his throne. She must drive the English out of France. It was an absurd command. She was an illiterate peasant girl, perhaps 16 years old. She had no connections, no money, and no military experience whatsoever. How could she possibly approach a prince? How could she lead an army? The very idea was laughable. But Joan believed, and her belief was unshakable. The first obstacle Joan faced was convincing anyone to take her seriously. In 1428, she walked to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs to meet with the local military commander, a man named Robert de Baudricourt. She told him directly what she wanted. She needed an escort to take her to the Dauphin. God had commanded it. Baudricourt, a practical and experienced soldier, looked at this young peasant girl and laughed in her face. He told her father to take her home and give her a good slapping. Joan was dismissed as a lunatic or a fool, but she did not give up. She returned again and again. She persisted with a calm and determined certainty that slowly began to unnerve those around her. Her persistence eventually began to work. News of the strange girl who claimed to hear heavenly voices spread through the region. Local people, desperate for any sign of hope, began to wonder if perhaps she was telling the truth. Joan also made a prophecy that proved accurate. She announced that the French would suffer a great defeat near Orleans. When news arrived that this had indeed happened, people began to look at her differently. Perhaps she did have some connection to the divine. Finally, Robert de Baudricourt relented. He was not necessarily a believer, but he was willing to let someone else decide. He provided Joan with a small escort of men and sent her on her way to see the Dauphin. To make the journey, Joan needed to transform her appearance. She cropped her dark hair short like a man's. She put away her red peasant dress and put on male clothing, trousers, a tunic, boots and a cap. This was not a disguise born of shame. She would later say that her voices had commanded her to dress this way. The male clothing served practical purposes as well. She would be travelling through dangerous territory, controlled by enemies. A young woman in a dress would be an obvious target. A figure in men's clothing was less vulnerable. It also served a symbolic purpose. She was stepping outside the role society had assigned to her. She was no longer simply a peasant girl. She was becoming something new, something the world had never quite seen before. Her decision to wear men's clothing would later become one of the central charges against her at her trial. In the medieval mind, the blurring of gender boundaries was deeply disturbing. The Bible seemed to forbid it, but Joan was unyielding. She wore the clothing that her voices commanded. She wore armour into battle. She slept in her doublet and hose, tightly laced, to protect herself from the soldiers around her. She would not compromise on this point, and her refusal would eventually contribute to her death. The journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin held his impoverished court, was long and perilous. Joan and her small escort had to travel hundreds of miles through territory, swarming with English soldiers and hostile Burgundian forces. They travelled mostly at night to avoid detection. They crossed swollen rivers and slept in fields. At every moment they risked capture, imprisonment, or death. Yet Joan displayed no fear. Her faith in her mission was absolute. She told her companions that they need not worry. Her voices assured her they would arrive safely. And they did. After 11 days of hard travel, Joan reached the town of Chinon. She was about to meet the man whose fate she believed God had placed in her hands. The Dauphin Charles was a pathetic figure. He was about 26 years old, pale, thin, and physically unimpressive. His legs were so thin and weak that he walked with difficulty. He had been told his entire life that he was not truly the son of a king. His own mother had declared him a bastard. He was constantly surrounded by scheming courtiers who manipulated him for their own advantage. He controlled only a small portion of southern France. He had almost no money and a tiny, demoralised army. He had never been crowned king because the traditional coronation city of Reims was deep in English-controlled territory. He was the Dauphin, the crown prince, but he was a prince without a kingdom, a king without a crown. His cause seemed utterly hopeless. When Joan arrived at the court, the Dauphin decided to test her. He hid himself among a crowd of his courtiers, while another man sat on the throne dressed in royal finery. If this girl truly had divine guidance, he reasoned, she should be able to identify the real prince. Joan entered the great hall of the castle. She looked at the man on the throne for only a moment. Then she turned and walked directly to where the real Dauphin was hiding in the crowd. She knelt before him. She said she had been sent by God to help him reclaim his kingdom and see him crowned at Reims. The assembled courtiers were stunned. Joan then asked to speak with Charles privately. What she said to him in that private conversation has remained a mystery for 600 years. But when they emerged, the Dauphin's demeanour had changed. He seemed to believe her. Before Joan could be given any authority, she had to be examined. The Dauphin could not simply hand his cause over to a peasant girl who claimed to hear voices. What if she was a witch? What if she was a fraud? What if she was an agent of the enemy sent to deceive him? Charles sent Joan to the city of Poitiers, where a committee of the most learned theologians and scholars in his realm spent 3 weeks interrogating her. They questioned her about her voices, her visions, her faith, and her morals. They searched for any sign of heresy or demonic influence. They had her examined by a panel of noble ladies to verify that she was, as she claimed, a virgin. Virginity was considered a sign of purity and divine favour. A witch, it was believed, could not be a virgin. Joan faced the learned doctors with remarkable composure. She was illiterate and untrained, yet she answered their complex theological questions with simple and direct logic. When they asked her for a sign that her mission was from God, she replied that the sign would be the lifting of the siege of Orleans. God had not sent her to Poitiers to produce miracles for scholars. He had sent her to save France. Her certainty and her simple, unwavering faith impressed the committee. They found no evidence of evil. They concluded that the Dauphin should make use of her. There was nothing to lose, they reasoned. If she was a fraud, the enterprise would fail on its own. If she was truly sent by God, then refusing her would be a sin against heaven. With the approval of the theologians, Joan was given what she needed to fulfill her mission. She was provided with a suit of armour, made specially to fit her small frame. She was given a household of attendants, including a squire and pages, as befitted a military leader. She was given a banner, which she designed herself. It was white, decorated with an image of God holding the world, flanked by 2 angels. The words Jesus and Maria were written upon it. She considered this banner more important than her sword. She said she carried it into battle herself so that she would not have to kill anyone. And speaking of swords, she sent for one in a most unusual way. Her voices told her that a sword was buried behind the altar of the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois. She sent messengers to find it. They dug where she indicated and found an ancient sword covered in rust. When it was cleaned, 5 crosses were revealed on the blade. Joan set out for the city of Orleans in late April of 1429. Orleans was a city of immense strategic importance. It sat on the Loire River, the great natural boundary that separated English-controlled northern France from the Dauphin's territories in the south. If Orleans fell, there would be nothing to stop the English from sweeping south and extinguishing French resistance forever. The English had laid siege to the city for months. They had constructed a ring of fortifications around the city walls, great wooden bastilles manned by archers and soldiers. The citizens were starving, their soldiers were exhausted, morale was collapsing. The relief of Orleans had been attempted before and had failed. The situation seemed hopeless. And then Joan arrived. Her arrival had an immediate and electric effect on the French soldiers. Here was a girl of 17, dressed in armour, carrying a sacred banner, claiming that God had sent her to deliver them from their enemies. The common soldiers, who had been demoralised by years of defeat, were suddenly filled with a new energy. She was proof, living proof, that God had not abandoned France. She demanded that the soldiers confess their sins and behave virtuously. She drove the prostitutes out of the army camp. She insisted that the men attend mass and stop swearing. She forbade them from looting churches or harming civilians. Her presence seemed to transform the ragged, defeated force into something resembling an army of faith. Before the attack began, Joan did something that shocked everyone. She dictated a letter to the English commanders besieging the city. In blunt and fearless language, she demanded that they lift the siege and leave France immediately. She warned them that she was sent by God, and that if they did not obey, she would drive them out with a great slaughter. The English were stunned by her audacity. They shouted insults at her, calling her a witch and a cowgirl. They threatened to burn her if they captured her. But her bold letter served a purpose. It announced to friend and enemy alike that a new force had entered the war, a force that claimed divine authority. The siege of Orleans was broken in a matter of days. The attack began on May 4th, 1429. Joan was not a strategist. She did not command the army in a technical sense, but she was at the heart of every assault, riding forward with her banner held high, inspiring the soldiers to impossible acts of courage. During the assault on one of the English fortifications, she was struck by an arrow. It pierced her shoulder above her breast. She fell from a ladder in terrible pain and wept, but she pulled the arrow from her own flesh. Her wound was dressed with olive oil. She returned to the battle that same day. The soldiers, seeing her wounded yet still fighting, were filled with renewed fury. They stormed the English position and took it. The decisive moment came on May 7th. The French attacked the main English fortress called Les Tourelles, which guarded the bridge into Orleans. The assault was long and bloody. Many were killed. At one point it seemed the attack would fail, and the French commanders wanted to withdraw. Joan refused. She planted her banner at the edge of the ditch surrounding the fortress and called for one more assault. The soldiers, inspired by her presence, surged forward. The English line broke. The commander of the English garrison, a feared knight named William Glasdale, fell from the bridge into the river and drowned under the weight of his armour. The fortress was taken. By the next morning, the surviving English forces abandoned their remaining positions and retreated. The siege of Orleans, which had lasted for 7 months, was over. Joan had accomplished what no one believed possible. The victory at Orleans transformed Joan from a curiosity into a legend. Word of the miracle spread across France. The peasant girl who had lifted the siege became known as the Maid of Orleans. She was proof that God was on the side of France. But Joan knew her work was not finished. Her voices had given her a clear mission. She had to see the Dauphin crowned king at the cathedral in Reims. Until he was properly anointed with holy oil, his claim to the throne could always be challenged. The coronation was essential. It would give Charles divine legitimacy. It would prove to the world that he was the true king of France, chosen by God. There was a problem. The city of Reims was deep in enemy territory. To reach it, the French army would have to march through lands controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. Many of the Dauphin's cautious advisors argued against the campaign. It was too dangerous, it was too ambitious. They favoured a slower, more careful strategy of reclaiming territory piece by piece. Joan had no patience for such caution. She urged immediate action. Every day they waited was a day lost. She warned the Dauphin that her time was short. Her voices had told her she would last only a year, perhaps a little more. She had to act now. Joan's will prevailed. The army marched north in June of 1429. Along the way, they encountered English-held towns and fortresses. Some surrendered without a fight, their garrisons terrified by the legend of the Maid. Others had to be taken by force. At the town of Jargeau, Joan once again led the assault from the front. She was climbing a scaling ladder against the walls when a stone struck her helmet and knocked her to the ground. She rose, dazed but unhurt, and continued the attack. The town fell. City after city opened its gates. Meung, Beaugency, Troyes. The march to Reims became a triumphal procession. On July 17, 1429, the Dauphin Charles entered the great cathedral of Reims. Joan stood near the altar, holding her sacred banner. The cathedral was packed with nobles, clergy, and common people. The ancient coronation ritual was performed. Charles was anointed with the holy oil from the sacred vial that, according to legend, had been brought from heaven by a dove for the baptism of the first Christian king of France. This holy oil, the sacred chrism, was believed to have miraculous properties. Its use in the coronation ceremony gave the French king a sacred character that no other European monarch possessed. The crown was placed upon his head. He was no longer the Dauphin, the disinherited prince, the man mocked as a bastard. He was now King Charles VII of France, anointed by God. The ceremony was magnificent. The great bells of the cathedral rang out over the city. The people cheered in the streets. For Joan, it was the moment of her greatest triumph. She knelt before the new king and wept. She told him that the will of God had been fulfilled. She had accomplished the two things her voices had commanded. She had lifted the siege of Orleans. She had seen the king crowned. When asked later why her banner was displayed so prominently during the coronation, Joan gave a reply that revealed both her pride and her humility. She said, "It had borne the burden. It was only right that it should have the honour." Many believe the coronation at Reims was the high point of Joan's career. She had accomplished something miraculous. In just a few months, she had lifted the siege of Orleans, won a string of victories, and seen her king crowned. Her legend was secure forever. But the months that followed the coronation were frustrating and difficult. The king and his advisors did not share her burning urgency. They preferred negotiation and political manoeuvring to continued warfare. They opened peace talks with the Duke of Burgundy, who was technically at war with them. Joan was suspicious of these negotiations. She wanted to press the attack, to march on Paris, to drive the English into the sea. She felt her time slipping away. An attempt was made to take Paris in early September of 1429. Joan was at the forefront of the assault. She led her men against the heavily fortified gates of the city. But this time there was no miracle. The Parisian defences were strong, and the citizens, many of whom were loyal to the Duke of Burgundy, fought back fiercely. Joan was wounded again. A crossbow bolt struck her in the thigh. She fell in a ditch outside the city walls, still calling for her men to continue the attack. But the assault faltered. The king, who had never truly believed in the attack, ordered a retreat. Paris remained in English hands. Joan had suffered her first major defeat. The failure at Paris marked a turning point. The king showered Joan with honours. He ennobled her family, allowing them to take a coat of arms. But he seemed increasingly unwilling to listen to her military advice. Joan spent the winter of 1429 to 1430 in a frustrating state of semi-retirement. She participated in minor skirmishes and sieges, but the great campaign she longed for never materialised. She became entangled in court politics, a world she did not understand and for which she was not suited. The bold, divine warrior of Orleans was being reduced to a pawn in games played by cautious, calculating men. In the spring of 1430, Joan took action on her own. Without explicit orders from the king, she led a small force north to defend the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. On May the 23rd, she led a sortie out of the town gates to attack the Burgundian camp. The attack initially went well, but then something went wrong. Burgundian reinforcements arrived, and the French were pushed back toward the city. Joan, as always, was at the rear of the retreat, covering her soldiers. She was trying to re-enter the city when the gates were closed. Whether this was an accident in the chaos of battle or a deliberate betrayal by enemies within the town has been debated for centuries. Whatever the reason, Joan was trapped outside the walls. She was pulled from her horse and captured. A group of Burgundian soldiers dragged her to the ground and took her prisoner. The Maid of Orleans, the saviour of France, was now a captive of her enemies. No, the Burgundians were elated. They had captured the greatest prize imaginable. They immediately began negotiations to sell her to the highest bidder. The English were desperate to get their hands on her. Joan had humiliated them on the battlefield. She had shattered the myth of English invincibility. They blamed her for their defeats and they wanted revenge. They wanted to destroy her. King Charles VII, the man Joan had placed on the throne, did almost nothing to save her. He made no serious effort to ransom her. He sent no army to rescue her. He offered no protest when she was sold to the English. His inaction has puzzled and angered historians for centuries. Perhaps he feared that any attempt to save her would disrupt his ongoing peace negotiations with Burgundy. Perhaps he was advised by jealous courtiers who were glad to see the troublesome peasant girl removed. Perhaps he was simply a weak and ungrateful man. Whatever his reasons, he abandoned her, and the debt he owed her would never be repaid in her lifetime. The English paid a king's ransom for Joan and handed her over to the church for trial. She was to be tried for heresy by an ecclesiastical court in the city of Rouen, which was the headquarters of English power in France. The trial was a legal proceeding, but it was also a political weapon. If Joan could be convicted of heresy, it would prove that her victories had been achieved not through God, but through the devil. It would delegitimize Charles VII. His coronation, inspired by a witch, would be tainted. The English desperately needed to prove that Joan was an agent of Satan. The chief judge at the trial was the Bishop of Beauvais, a man named Pierre Cauchon. He was a corrupt and ambitious churchman who owed his career to the English. He had a personal grudge against Joan. He had been driven from his diocese when the French recaptured it, and he blamed her. The trial was conducted with a veneer of legality, but it was a sham from the beginning. Joan was denied a lawyer. She was asked trick questions designed to trap her. She was subjected to long hours of interrogation, sometimes multiple sessions in a single day. She was interrogated for months, exhausted, alone, and guarded by brutal English soldiers who, she later testified, tried to assault her in her cell. She was kept in chains, bound hand and foot. She was held in a secular prison, guarded by English soldiers, rather than in a church prison guarded by women, as church law required for a female prisoner. Her English guards taunted her and threatened her. They kept her in constant fear. The conditions of her imprisonment were designed to break her spirit, to make her confess to anything, just to escape her torment. Despite all this, she defended herself with astonishing courage and skill. The interrogators were learned theologians and lawyers. Joan was an illiterate peasant girl, yet she parried their questions with a combination of simple faith and sharp wit that often left them frustrated. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a trick question designed to trap her into either heresy or presumption, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." When asked why she wore men's clothing, which was considered a serious offence, she said her voices commanded it and she would obey God over men. When asked if St. Michael, when he appeared to her, was naked, she replied, "Do you think God has nothing to clothe him with?" The judges pored over every detail of her life, searching for evidence of witchcraft and demonic communion. They questioned her endlessly about her voices. Were they real or imaginary? Were they from God or from the devil? Joan never wavered. Her saints were real. They spoke to her. They guided her. They were sent by God to save France. She would not deny them to save her life. The court pressed her on her refusal to submit to the authority of the Church on earth. She replied that she would submit to God and the Pope, but not to a court that was so obviously her enemy. Her defiance infuriated them. After months of interrogation, Joan was finally brought to a public abjuration ceremony on May 24th, 1431. She was led to a scaffold in a cemetery in Rouen. Before a large crowd, the charges against her were read out. She was told that if she confessed her sins and submitted to the Church, her life would be spared. She would be sentenced to life in prison, but she would live. If she refused, she would be burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic. Facing death, Joan broke. She signed or made her mark on a document of abjuration. She agreed to give up wearing men's clothes and to submit to the Church. She was led back to her prison cell, her life apparently saved. But the English were furious. They had not paid a fortune for Joan, only to see her rot in a prison cell. They wanted her dead. A few days later, Joan was found once again wearing men's clothing. She later said her English guards had taken her women's clothes and left her nothing else to wear. She also said her voices had reproached her for her moment of weakness. She told her captors that her saints had spoken to her again. She recanted her abjuration. She declared that everything she had said before was true. Her voices were from God. She had been sent to save France. She would not deny it again, no matter the cost. By putting on men's clothes and recanting her confession, she became what the law called a relapsed heretic. The penalty for a relapsed heretic was death, and there could be no appeal. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led out of her cell for the last time. She was brought to the old market square of Rouen, where a huge crowd had gathered to witness her execution. She was dressed in a long white gown, the garment of a penitent. A tall cap was placed on her head bearing the words heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. She was tied to a stake atop a high platform of wood. The pyre had been built unusually tall so that the executioner could not reach her to shorten her suffering. She would feel every moment of the flames. The crowd that day was vast. English soldiers ringed the square. Nobles and clergy watched from nearby buildings. Common people packed the streets. Some had come out of curiosity. Others hoped to see a witch get what she deserved. But many were simply drawn by the fame of the Maid of Orleans, wanting to witness the end of a legend. A sermon was preached before the execution, condemning Joan as a heretic and warning the crowd against her errors. She listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. Before the fire was lit, Joan asked for a cross. An English soldier took pity on her and made a small cross from 2 pieces of wood. She kissed it and placed it in her bosom. A larger crucifix from a nearby church was brought and held before her face, so she could look upon it as she died. She asked a priest to hold it high so she could see it through the smoke and flames. The fire was lit, the flames rose around her. Witnesses said she cried out to her saints, to St. Michael, to St. Catherine, to St. Margaret. She called upon Jesus, over and over again, 6 times or more according to those who stood close enough to hear. As the smoke and fire engulfed her, her last word was the name of her Lord. She was 19 years old. Witnesses were deeply moved by her death. Even hardened English soldiers wept. One of them was reported to have said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." The executioner, a man whose job was death, later confessed that he was deeply troubled, fearing he was damned for killing a holy woman. Joan's ashes were collected and thrown into the Seine River. The English wanted no relics. English. They wanted her erased from the earth, but while they could destroy her body, they could not destroy her legend. The war continued after Joan's death, but the tide had turned. The spirit she had ignited in France did not die with her. The French soldiers who had fought beside her remembered. The people who had cheered her in the streets remembered. They had seen that God could favour France. They had seen that the English could be defeated. That belief, that renewed sense of national destiny, proved more powerful than any army. Within a few years, the French forces began to push the English back. The Duke of Burgundy eventually made peace with King Charles VII, depriving England of its most powerful ally. The reconciliation happened in 1435, just 4 years after Joan's death. Without Burgundian support, the English position in France began to crumble. City after city was reclaimed. Paris, which had rejected Joan, opened its gates to Charles in 1436. The English were pushed steadily northward. Normandy fell in 1450. The once mighty English holdings in France were reduced to rubble. In 1453, more than 20 years after Joan's death, the 100 Years' War finally came to an end with the Battle of Castillon. The English were driven out of France, retaining only the port city of Calais. The mission Joan had been given was complete. France was free. The kingdom she had fought for would go on to become one of the great powers of Europe. The girl who had heard voices in a garden had saved a nation. King Charles VII, the man Joan had saved, eventually took steps to clear her name. In 1456, a new church trial was held. This time, Joan was not there to defend herself. Instead, her mother and surviving witnesses testified on her behalf. The original trial was examined and found to be deeply flawed and politically motivated. The verdict was overturned. Joan was declared innocent. The original judgment was torn up and publicly burned in the very square where she had died. She was no longer a condemned heretic. She was a martyr. Centuries later, the church took the final step. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was officially declared a saint by Pope Benedict XV. The peasant girl who heard voices, the warrior who lifted sieges, the prisoner who faced her judges alone, the young woman who burned at the stake calling on her Lord, was now Saint Joan of Arc, patron saint of France and one of the most famous and beloved figures in all of history. The story of Joan of Arc is not simply a story of battles and politics. It is a story about the extraordinary power of faith. It is a story about what one person, even a young and powerless person, can achieve when they believe absolutely in their purpose. It is also a story about the dark side of power. Joan was used when she was useful, and abandoned when she became inconvenient. She was killed not for anything she did, but for what she represented. She was a threat to the established order, a peasant who defied her social position, a woman who wore armour and led men into battle. The men who killed her could not allow such a figure to live. But in the end, Joan won. She won because her story lived on. Every generation since her death has retold her tale. She's been the subject of countless books, plays, operas and films. Mark Twain wrote a novel about her that he considered his finest work. George Bernard Shaw wrote a famous play. She has been depicted as a saint, a madwoman, a feminist icon, and a nationalist hero. French patriots invoke her name. So do Catholic traditionalists and modern feminists. Filmmakers and novelists return to her story again and again. She has been played by Ingrid Bergman and Jean Seberg and Mila Jovovich. Everyone sees in Joan what they want to see. But the core of her story remains the same. Her story resonates because it touches something deep in the human spirit. She was young and powerless in a world run by old and powerful men. She was uneducated in an age when knowledge was power. She was female in a world that had no place for female warriors. And yet she changed everything. She proved that the world as it is does not have to be the world as it remains. She showed that one person, driven by absolute conviction, can move mountains. She was a young woman who believed she had a mission from God, and who pursued that mission to the very end, no matter the cost. She was burned alive at 19, yet her name has echoed across 600 years. When you walk through the old market square of Rouen today, you can see a tall modern cross marking the spot where she died. The church of Saint Joan of Arc stands nearby, built in her honour. Her image is everywhere in France. She appears on statues and stained glass windows, in museums and on postage stamps. She is the second patron saint of France, forever linked with the nation she helped to save. The shepherd girl from Domremy, who heard voices in her father's garden, became one of the most famous women who ever lived. In the end, Joan's greatest legacy is the simple truth that conviction and courage can change the world. She had no army, no wealth, no education, and no social standing. She had only her faith, and with that faith she altered the course of history. She proved that the circumstances of your birth do not determine your destiny. She proved that one voice, if strong enough and true enough, can be heard above the roar of armies and the thunder of cannons. They burned her body and scattered her ashes. They thought they were silencing her forever. But the flames that consumed her mortal form only immortalized her spirit. The questions that surrounded her in life have never been fully answered. Were her voices real? Was she touched by madness or touched by God? Historians and theologians and psychiatrists have debated for centuries. Perhaps she suffered from a form of epilepsy that caused vivid hallucinations. Perhaps she was a brilliant political manipulator who invented her divine mission to gain power. Or perhaps, just perhaps, something beyond the ordinary did speak to a peasant girl in a garden in Domremy. We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that she believed with every fibre of her being, and that her belief changed the world. The Maid of Orleans is still with us, a timeless symbol of hope, faith, and the extraordinary power of the human will. Her story reminds us that history is not made only by kings and generals, and those born to privilege. Sometimes it is made by the young and the obscure, by those the world has overlooked and dismissed. Sometimes a shepherd girl can save a kingdom. Sometimes a teenage peasant can become a saint. And sometimes, against all reason and expectation, the impossible happens. That is the enduring miracle of Joan of Arc.